Hi, Andy. So nice to see all of you. We were just counting backstage, and I think this is we've done 7 or 8 podcasts since I arrived, like a gazillion before I arrived at the most phenomenal levels, not starting in 1922 when the foundation was, when the organization was founded, but not so long after. I think since I arrived, 4 events. And so now I can look at the audience and know a lot of names. And I'm Leslie Vinjamori. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm the new president and chief executive officer of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The reason I know so many names is this has got to be the most extraordinary and the friendliest city in the world that hits at the global level. I have now I was actually emailing, WhatsApping with the former chair of Chatham House and saying, kind of regaling with stories of the number of homes I've been inside of, the number of restaurants, the number of people I've met. It is really extraordinary. So not only are we friendly, we're world class, and we're able to host some of the most high impact speakers at the most pressing moment in time. Today we're on the record. We're not always on the record. I think my first event was with General Mark Milley, and that was not on the record. It was under the Chatham House rule. Today, we have Alex Vindman, who is somebody that will be well known to any of you who follow Russia and Ukraine and geopolitics and questions of America's appropriate, ideal, and necessary global engagements and debate those issues. Alexander Vindman has recently written a book, so we have a kind of occasion, but he's certainly been well known to all of us long before he wrote that book, The Folly of Realism. We're institutionally independent, we're nonpartisan, and we don't take institutional positions. But as you can see from the rest of the title, the people that speak here have very strong views. How the West deceived itself about Russia and betrayed Ukraine. So we have a great basis for a conversation. And Alex Vindman is going to be in conversation with somebody who I've known for a long time through many networks, and who is another very distinguished author and scholar, John Gans. John Gans, not recently, but in the last several years, wrote a book called White House Warriors: How the National Security Transformed the American Way of War. So John's going to be speaking with Alex about his book and obviously about Russia and Ukraine, but he also comes from a base of like extraordinary publication. They both served the United States. I'd like to say our country, but I'm sure it's not everybody's country in this audience. But they both served the United States in very important ways. John Gans was chief speechwriter to the Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. And he is currently he has many roles, but one of them is as a senior fellow at Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. And he resides in a beautiful farmhouse in New Jersey, commuting between New York and Washington, D.C. Alexander Vindman is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, former Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council. He was political military officer for Russia in the Pentagon. He was an attaché on the ground in Russia, in Kyiv. He knows his subject. He has deep experience in the field, so to speak. We are also entering this conversation. We are just sort of counting the days. Boy, the days go, and it feels like from day to day we're in a different universe. It was a week tomorrow since the meeting in Alaska that sort of felt like it was changing the game. It's 3 days since we counted 8 senior officials from Europe turned up in the White House, in the Oval Office, to talk to the President of the United States of America about the importance of transatlantic unity, about the importance of defending Ukraine, about the importance of security assurances, asking that a ceasefire come before peace negotiations. You all know, because you're one of the most informed audiences that exists in our country. But just to kind of recapture where we are, and as we've seen, there's been what looks to be quite a significant attack on U.S. interests in Ukraine just today. So with that said, we're going to begin with what I know will be a tremendous conversation, and then we'll open it up to all of you. I am really looking forward to sitting in the audience and listening to this. So please join me in welcoming Alexander Vindman and John Gans.
Well, good evening. Good to be with you, Alex, and good to be with everybody here. Thank you, Leslie, and everybody at the Chicago Council. I've known Leslie for many years, and I'm so glad to see her here at one of the finest organizations working on this issue and in one of the best towns on the planet. So very good to be with you. And also wonderful to be here with Alex, and I'll ask questions in a minute. But when I talk to students and when I speak with students, and someday when I tell my kids, I will tell them that one of the most interesting things about living in interesting times is you get to see meet some truly interesting people. And these have not been subtle or simple times in global affairs over the last 5 to 10 years, and especially in the United States. But we have met some truly amazing people in that time. And Alex Vindman is one of them. And I was impressed with him before I ever met him, and I'm glad I get to call him a friend. So thank you for being here, Alex, and to talk about an amazing book and a truly amazing moment in the world. And so I wanted to sort of start off a little bit with who you are and where you came from and how you got here. And I think most of this audience probably remembers you from a singular image, which is you in full uniform standing before the House Intelligence Committee in November of 2019. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of tell a little bit of what was your life like before you stood up and took the oath that day? And not just in the weeks and months before, but just what was your trajectory? Where were you headed? What were you thinking? And what were you thinking that day?
John, it's awesome being up here with you. I've considered you a friend for years, and frankly, Sage Counsel, especially when I was going through the impeachment testimony, it was your book that really resonated with me. And thank you to the Chicago Council for hosting me. So it all started way back in, no, seriously. First of all, I think for just quick background, my family immigrated from the Soviet Union, from Soviet Ukraine in 1979. I was a toddler when we got to the United States. I think in my family, all my brothers served in uniform at one point or another. My twin brother and I made a career of it. I think part of that was a recognition of the fact that we were able to participate in the American dream and come from humble background as refugees and make something of ourselves in this unique country. That started almost a 22-year career in the military, and pretty awesome trajectory. I did all the fun things in the early part of my career. Airborne, Ranger School, troop leader in Korea, deployments in combat. And then at some point, I decided I could leverage my language and cultural understanding and become what's called a foreign area officer. So diplomatic postings and regional expertise and so forth. That career ended up serving me quite well. I was posted in Ukraine. I was posted in Moscow, Russia, in a period where we transitioned from difficult, challenging relationships with Russia to really what seemed like a low point back then. I served in between 2012 and 2015, and then was directed to go back to the Pentagon and work on the Joint Staff. And there I wrote the National Military Strategy for Russia, the global campaign plan for Russia, how we were going to actually implement the strategy and manage all the day-to-day affairs, including all those. If we think about that point in time, 2015, 16, 17, it's when we were co-located with the Russians in Syria fighting ISIL. So those were lots of interactions with the Russians. And then based on all that body of work, invited to serve in the White House and take this strategic vision that I helped craft and shape and elevate it to a whole of government approach. And that first year of that tenure, I was under Donald Trump. was challenging. My first day on the job was Helsinki. The last time there was a major summit before a week ago. And instead of doing the typical kind of normal in-processing, it was basically a fire drill, figuring out how to rationalize what had just unfolded, where the president had sided with Vladimir Putin against the intelligence community, and to advance his own narrative that there was no collusion or anything of that nature. So I settled on the fact that maybe it might be challenging to work with Russia, which he had a deep affinity for, even though he signed this national security strategy and so forth. And I put a lot of stock into the relationships that we were building with Ukraine, for instance, or the Caucasus, or the Baltic states, or something of that nature. Those were all in my portfolio. And challenging as it was, I was still able to navigate the national security process and advance the U.S. national security until it came to 2020 on the horizon. And Donald Trump saw an opportunity to put the squeeze on Ukraine in the midst of a war and extract a investigation into Joe Biden, his principal rival. And it happened on my watch. I was a responsible official, and I wasn't going to sit on the information or say, it's somebody else's job to take care of it. I reported it. That precipitated the impeachment inquiries and the first impeachment of Donald Trump. That also ended my military career.
So that brings me to, what's the trajectory been since you've been out? So you left White House in February of 2020?
Yep.
February of 2020. Friday, I think, if I remember. And what has life been like since then? How's it been out of uniform? What's it? You wrote a dissertation. You've gotten your doctorate. You've done lots of different things. What have you been trying to think about? How's it been out of uniform?
So I kind of have a bit of a North Star. My first public statement out of uniform was an op-ed I wrote in the Washington Post on day one out of military service, and I basically explained why I was forced out and couldn't continue on in service in uniform, but I was going to serve out of uniform. And I directed myself towards advancing U.S. national security, advocating for public servants, and advocating for values-based leadership. And I've been looking for opportunities to do that. So I run a think tank now called the Institute for Informed American Leadership, really interestingly engineered, where I could talk directly to decision makers under the former administration, to the White House, to the legislative branch. I could leverage my expertise and a following to advocate for what I think is important for U.S. national security, and I also help advance the political careers of veterans looking to serve out of uniform also. So in general, looking for different ways, and a nonprofit foundation that's directed towards helping Ukraine. So I look for good projects to be able to participate in and continue to serve.
That's great. Well, one of your great projects brings us to here tonight, which is you've written 2 books now in 5 years, which is pretty incredible output, I would just say. First one was Here Right Matters, which is an amazing book about your life and service. And this book is The Folly of Realism, which is an amazing in-depth history of American foreign policy really over the last 35 years. And it's on sale here tonight, so hopefully people can grab a copy. But I think this is about Ukraine and about Russia. And, people who are casual observers or just catching the news on Twitter or on social media know Ukraine and Russia are both in the news. But you really looked at this over the course of 30 or 40 years. And as a case study for American statecraft, I'm wondering what grade do you give American policymakers trying to do this sort of hard work of foreign affairs and really over the last 40 years leading the world? What grade do you give them for a foreign policy based on this case study?
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think that we've had at times better practitioners and at times worse practitioners. I think we're now at a low point, certainly, with this administration repeating and amplifying the mistakes of the past. I would say that my review of foreign policy over 6 administrations was probably a little bit more kind to mistakes were made by George H.W. Bush and President Clinton, but probably somewhat understandable if you think about the context emerging out of 40 years of Cold War figuring out how to navigate this idea of drawing Russia and these 15 republics into a democratic Western world, maybe a little bit of a grasping at misplaced hopes on what you might be able to accomplish with Russia that in certain regards was unreformed, and fears if we took a bit of a hard line, if we were more conditional. Same thing with regards to Ukraine. I think, we wanted nuclear weapons out of Ukraine. We thought that was a way to better secure ourselves in the world, a non-proliferation regime. Ukraine inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal, 4,000 weapons. So in that period of time in the 90s, I'd say that is probably a B or so, mainly because I think they attempted to navigate a very challenging period of transition. I think when you get into the 2000s and beyond, it becomes a little bit more hard to justify the kinds of engagements we had with Russia that was already building a track record of whether or was earlier in the 90s with frozen conflicts and putting so-called peacekeepers really to maintain influence in certain regions, or the first and second Chechen wars, the propping up of genocidal regimes in the Balkans. Russia as a spoiler and graduating relatively quickly from, maybe coercion in the 90s to hybrid warfare in the 2000s and to outright aggression. I think the fact that we didn't understand that conditions were changing and an attempt to transform our relationship with Russia and as well as support the regimes or the states under threat, I think that to me is a little bit harder to justify. So a little bit more critical of those mistakes in the later period.
So less than a B.
Less than a B.
That sounds good. All right, that sounds good. So this book is fascinating because you played a part in the foreign policy towards Ukraine and towards Russia. And you took some great lengths and you were working on the ground at the front lines of some of this piece. So what's your favorite part about working on this book? Because you interviewed amazing people, you traveled, you did lots of things. What's your favorite part about the book?
So the certainly it was fantastic being able to have the access to interview former presidents and secretaries and ministers of state and ministers of foreign affairs. Those were all really quite interesting and insightful. Certainly, I recognize that as righteous and honorable as they attempted to be, they were also trying to kind of build a legacy. So some of it you would have to be, a little more critical about what actually happened and coincides with the history of the moment instead of looking back years. That was fascinating. That was interesting. I really enjoyed the project of working. Strangely as it sounds, this is my doctoral dissertation. So I was under pressure to finish up my degree. This revision is complete rewrite of the book for the general audience. So I don't know if I really, I enjoyed being able to dive into the deeper history, provide a concise background on what was going on and derive certain conclusions about the way that the U.S. operated with regards to Russia and Ukraine, and frankly extrapolate some conclusions not just about Russia and Ukraine, but as a case study on the way we conduct ourselves around the world with other great powers, with other crises. I think this folly of short-term transactionalism is something that is cross-cutting. I think the fact that we grasp onto misplaced hopes because we don't necessarily understand our counterparts as well as we should, or fears, that is something that we, mistakes that we repeat. If you think about the last 20 years of war in the Middle East, we thought we could roll into Iraq and do some depose the regime and do some nation building. We might still be the singular superpower, but we have limits on our power. But one aspect of it that was interesting is that I could also tell a little bit about my firsthand experiences. And there's a part in the book where I talk about operating as an attaché on the border between Russia and Ukraine. On the Russian side of the border, the Russians were playing at the fact that this war was all internal and that it was they weren't propping it up. And my job as an attaché working for the Defense Intelligence Agency was to observe and report, and being able to have some of that really enjoyable experience of catching the Russians red-handed pushing formations and military material across the border.
Amazing.
So.
Amazing. Well, I will tell you, they say you can't judge a book by a cover. I have now read this book twice because you sent it to me as a PDF and then you sent me, and then I bought a copy. And it wasn't until today that I realized that there's somebody on the picture of the book here, which just shows you that I focused a little bit on more on the words. But this is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin came to power almost 26 years ago in Russia. What is the one thing the United States has gotten right about Vladimir Putin, and what is something we're getting wrong about him right now?
I think I'll start with what we consistently seem to get wrong. I think we attempt resets oftentimes. There have been anomalies. I mean, I think there have been times where we tried to take a firm stance. Some of the posturing from President Obama, for instance, a little bit more tough-minded, but in terms of follow through with sanctions or supporting, Ukraine or something like that, faltered. But I think, by and large, we think that we should be charming them when the Russians actually are much better to respond. They respond much better to frank and kind of stern and clear communications and actions. I think that, by and large, they read the way we attempt to engage them as an opening to exploit instead of maybe even being a little bit more confrontational would be helpful in this particular relationship. It does not precipitate any escalation spirals. The Russians are very, very concerned about any direct confrontation with the West. That is the last thing that they want, is to precipitate a direct confrontation. What do we get right? That's a tougher one. I'm sure we get things right with them. I can't think of anything at the top of my head. Well, I mean,
it's for the next book.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Well, if you think of anything, we have a few more minutes, and this is a good moment to remind everybody that we're going to be asking questions in about 20 minutes. And those online, if you'd like to ask questions, you can go to ccga.live to ask a question down there, and we'll be able to.
I did think of something.
So perfect.
So I think at times we've correctly categorized Russia as far less than the Soviet Union and greatly diminished. We recognize that some of our leaders, I think, notable commentary from both John McCain and Hillary Clinton at times, especially in the aftermath of the Georgian War in 2008. It's a gas station with nuclear weapons is one of the famous lines. And I think that to a certain extent that's true. We understand that, but in terms of follow through, we still greatly buy into Russian exceptionalism. Yes, it's partially because of the size. It's partially because of we had a maybe inflated view of their conventional military as the second largest military in the world, their centrality to kind of petrochemicals. But we have gotten it right at times. We just haven't figured out how to navigate that relationship sufficiently well.
That's great. So you have actually done the work of arranging and staffing meetings between the President of the United States and his counterparts abroad. We've now had as Leslie pointed out, two pretty extraordinary moments of presidential meetings over the last week. So let's focus on each one separately. What did you make of last week's meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Alaska? From the stagecraft to the substance, how did it look from the outside? And I think you probably look at them different than most of us. So how should people be seeing these things, and how should they judge them?
So, I mean, I had a visceral reaction, disgust to a certain extent. The reason it was visceral is because my first day, as I mentioned, on the National Security Council was Helsinki. So I just remember, what ended up being a fire drill to try to rationalize what the president was doing, figure out how that advanced his national security strategy that he signed and we were tasked to implement, and that this was a significant setback for both our alliance, European security, Ukraine, and also advanced the cause of Russia and authoritarian regimes, that everything is so utterly transactional, relationships don't matter, context doesn't matter, that you could potentially effectively manipulate the president to have him parrot your lines. I mean, I took Trump's comments on the plane ride over to Alaska. He did an audio interview as him being actually pretty well prepared. And it's very difficult to prepare Donald Trump. He pretty much doesn't really take prep because he doesn't think he needs to know anything besides what he already knows. So prep usually then devolves down into really a series of bullet points to kind of take away. These are the things. So when he did this audio interview, it was clear to me that he was actually pretty concerned. He was nervous, and that he was going in with some sort of game plan. What struck me most and what actually probably most upset me about the summit, yes, it was the fact that, there was pageantry around this war criminal, and that, I made a comment on social media. The only reason you should step foot on U.S. soil is to be arrested and brought to The Hague for trial. But it was the fact that it concerns me that even though he was somewhat prepped, he fell apart on execution. So that this is a person that even if he's somewhat prepared, he is not necessarily up to the task of navigating these very, very complex tasks. And the next time there's a confrontation, I think Putin is going to be more comfortable. And the next time there's a confrontation with Xi, I think that he's going to be more comfortable, that he could pull the wool over Trump's eyes or manipulate him. And as a sign of how this was what I've referred to as a mitigated disaster, we had 8 world leaders come in just a couple days later. And there was a historian that I follow on social media that kind of described it about as good as it can be. Now, the Trump administration says, this is great. We got 8 world leaders here. That's never happened before. And this historian basically said, well, it's like saying that you're a patient on the deathbed. You have 8 or 7 doctors surrounding you, consulting, and the priest walks in and you're saying it's great. So they managed to do something. I mean, they managed to stabilize the patient in this case on Monday, just earlier this week. But there's a huge amount of work to do. And all those gains that Trump thought he had, the Russians are already, pulled the rug out from under the administration. Everything from security guarantees. Now there's security guarantees, but Russia is one of the guarantors and China is one of the guarantors. What is it? Totally meaningless. So really a huge setback. And this idea of levying sanctions to pressure Russia to end this war, that's now a more distant prospect.
So a week of high stakes diplomacy, statecraft, front page, huge presidential involvement. You feel like the trajectory in Ukraine is status quo as of a week ago, or do you think it's heading in a worse direction, better direction? Where do you think it's headed?
I think it's largely status quo for the time being, meaning that, and the status quo being that the trajectory is Ukraine as more self-sufficient to a certain extent. The Europeans as more self-sufficient. The Europeans as increasingly the biggest backers. They've already spent much more money than the U.S. in terms of propping up Ukraine's economy and doing what they can to support Ukraine's war efforts. So that's been the trajectory really since the Oval Office meeting back in February. And I think that's going to be the case going forward, because the natural proclivity, I think, of the Trump administration is an affinity towards strongmen, whether it's Xi, whether it's Kim Jong-un, whether it's Vladimir Putin, in a deep animus towards Ukraine. That's where I predicted this relationship was going to be. I thought that there might be a pivot point in that Trump could be sufficiently embarrassed or pressured into recognizing that Putin is the biggest impediment to his desires for peace. I think it's been pretty well covered that Trump wants peace so like this he could claim legitimacy to get the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think if these types of things, I mean, it's true. He talks about it repeatedly, but I think there still might be a point in which Putin demonstrates that he's in fact the bad actor, and that overcomes Trump's bromance with him, and that maybe there's an opportunity to pivot to more pressure on Russia, greater support for Ukraine. But right now it's a muddling through really a kind of a lack of strategy. And the Europeans have said that they were going to do more, and they have taken some tentative steps, but really a much, much more robust approach from the Europeans is really necessary at this point.
Speaking of sort of the next step, I remember you and I got together a few months before the invasion, and you were, I think, very clear-eyed of where you thought the standoff would go. In the days, even just hours after the invasion, you were for a far more aggressive response from the United States and Europe to the invasion and to Russia in particular. Why do you think there was so much hesitation starting in 2022 and has continued? And why did this approach of gradual escalation, which we've seen not work in the past, take hold in Washington? And do you think it was effective over the last few years in terms of trying to achieve America's and Ukraine's objectives in the war?
So I think it's important to frame why I think there's greater latitude to take this kind of approach. One thing that I think I covered either in this book or the last book was this a confrontation between the Russian chief of defense, Gerasimov, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joe Dunford, when I served in the Pentagon. It was when U.S. cruise missiles were striking bases in Syria that were occupied by Russia, or they had a presence there. And and I'm translating this phone call, and Gerasimov calls basically to threaten the U.S. and say, "Don't take this action. We'll defend ourselves." And Chairman Dunford basically stared him down and said, "We will defend ourselves. Tell your people to take shelter." And you could see this the head of the Russian military that would feel comfortable threatening anybody to get what he wants. The air just kind of, or him, whatever the term is, he just basically kind of folded. And I've seen this happen many times when the Russians, may feel very, very comfortable with smaller states in a predatory manner, but they don't want to tangle with the United States. So in my experience, there is more latitude for us to advance our national security interests. The problem, to a certain extent, with what we've is and it's not just the Biden administration that was slow to realize this, because they increasingly did realize this and escalate support. But even in the George H.W. Bush administration that I refer to, we seem to focus in on the worst case scenarios always. We seem to focus in on the consequences of the worst case scenarios instead of the probabilities. When in the military, when we look at a situation, we think about the consequences and the probabilities. And that's how the intersection of those two help you gauge the risk. So the consequence could be catastrophic, but the probability is near zero because the Russians understand that it's mutually assured destruction. But what administrations seem to do is thinking that this starts an escalatory ladder and it leads to nuclear war. And this is the fear that captures their mind, and this is what they were concerned about. They also in the days leading up to this war, and I was brought in to be one of those folks that they consulted with, the National Security Council consulted with, to try to figure out how to navigate this particular challenge, and also to tell us all the great things that they were doing to keep us from being so critical, because there were a lot of people that were calling on them to do more. And one of the things that they also fell victim to is this lack of clarity of the fact that this war was coming. And they thought that if they took action, they could be the pretext or they could be the trigger for it. So those things were looming in a policymaker's mind. And then as the war started, the question is, well, does inserting ourselves into this war supporting Ukraine, is it meaningful? Because the theory back then was that Ukraine would fold in 3 days. So would it be futile to support Ukraine? And for the folks that studied Ukraine and understood Ukraine, that was not going to happen. That was never a realistic possibility. We're talking about the largest country in Europe, a country that's been fighting a war at that point for an extended period of time, and prepared to defend itself. And Russia was completely unprepared to face the resistance that the Ukrainians were prepared to offer. They didn't have anywhere near the force structure that they needed to. They didn't have a realistic assessment of how difficult this was going to be. They came in with their parade uniforms also, in case there's some reporting around this too, so because they thought that they would just roll in and then have a victory parade. And so the administration was lethargic in the opening days. And then in the subsequent days, the administration was thinking about, okay, well, how does Russia respond to us providing capability? Again, without fully understanding that, that there's more we could have done with regards to supporting Ukraine and pushing back on Russia. Eventually, and this is seriously a conversation I had with the administration, that you're going to do all these things that you think are impossible, but the best thing to do is to do them now instead of when it's a day late and a dollar short. And every now and then I would actually say, I told you that this was going to happen. Like when we provided F-16s, could we look at the next capability and look at it, introducing it, providing it now instead of waiting until it becomes irrelevant? So they caught on, but a little bit slow to learn. So as critical as that might sound for that administration, they did learn and they did make adjustments. I'd say the biggest successes they had were they rallied the democratic world around the cause of Ukraine. Ukraine did most of the lifting because they valiantly defended themselves, but they rallied the rest of the world and provided support and it bolstered Ukraine. Maybe the military support was inadequate and too slow, but they moved in that direction. This administration is taking the exact opposite view. They're taking a view of, well, let's see if we could entice the Russians, the aggressors. Let's see if we could reset the relationships with the Russians. How many times have we tried reset and it's failed? So unfortunately, it's repeating and amplifying the mistakes of the past because this administration, and that's part of the folly of realism, is that we're now at the stage where everything is utterly transactional, utterly short-sighted. It's the deal immediately in front of Donald Trump, and it's likely to get worse.
So you mentioned rallying the democratic world to the cause of Ukraine. One of the issues is that the rallying did not occur within the borders of the United States. Recent polling by the Council shows that support for Ukraine aid continues to be deeply partisan. It's about 75% of Democrats support military aid to Ukraine compared to about 51% of Republicans. From somebody who's now looked at this, worked on this issue in the White House, the most political place on earth, but also looked at it now over 30, 40 years of history, what does that sort of polarization mean for American foreign policy and our ability to sort of make the sort of long-term commitments required to help countries like Ukraine over 10, 20, 30 years?
So I think this is unfortunately another failure of the Biden administration. They didn't make an adequate case for why we should be supporting Ukraine to the American public on a consistent enough basis, because it's not just about taking the temperature from the American public that really is too busy living their own lives to pay attention. It's up to the leadership to explain why this is important, and part of that vacuum was filled by a Donald Trump that had a different story to tell about Russia being the good actor and Ukraine being corrupt and a waste of resources. So I think now we're in a world where it has become deeply partisan, but it didn't necessarily have to be that way. I think in general, there's a risk that, under the Trump administration, I don't think anything could be necessarily taken for granted. We might have some Republican China hawks at the moment, understanding that that's the long-term threat, but we could easily see a deal between Donald Trump and Xi and an about-face and pivot. So I don't know. I'm not sure if these issues should be defined by how they poll at a given moment, because that is quite fungible. I mean, that could change based on the way the leadership potentially points and explains this issue, which is really quite troubling.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. I mean, I think that we could very easily see a change from Donald Trump that would change that polling in a month or two,
Sure.
Which is fascinating, which is also part of the problem that we just follow leaders.
Yeah.
So one of the driving a piece of that is the sort of the concept and the sort of geopolitical force of nationalism. And I think that's been, a tripping point for American foreign policy, the nationalism of other countries. And I think it's also one of the reasons that the Soviet Union and the Russian leadership have struggled at times. What have you learned about nationalism as a force watching Ukraine over the last 5 years? And what have you learned about nationalism watching American politics over the last 5-10 years?
That's an interesting question. I'd say from Ukraine, it's clear that they're an extremely resilient society, and that part of the national identity of Ukraine has actually defined itself in opposition to Russia. I'd say in the 90s, Western Ukraine had a good sense of itself. Central and South and Eastern Ukraine had a different sense of itself. And there was a consistent divide between the East and West and North and South. And that the society is completely consolidated now in opposition to Russia and in the face of an existential threat. So part of that, I guess part of nationalism is this reaction to a powerful threat, internal or external. I wonder if that's something that we inevitably face because of our hyperpolarization in the U.S. domestically, or some external threat that we could easily face in the not so distant future. I mean, scenarios of a war in the Pacific are not entirely remote. So right now, I'm not sure if it's what we're experiencing is really nationalism as much as hyperpartisanship between two different views of the United States. I don't know. That's what I've got for that one.
All right. Well, we're gonna be starting to take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, we're gonna ask one more. But if you have questions online, please go to ccga.live and ask questions. I'm gonna have that memorized by the end of the night, and we'll get to questions in just 1 second. I think the last question I would ask you, Alex, is for people who are gonna be watching this, living busy lives. We're gonna start the fall. Kids are gonna be going to school. Everybody's gonna be busy. We've heard lots of things about land swaps, security guarantees, American backstops. What's the one issue you would keep an eye on if you were trying to keep an eye and try to say, okay, which way is the wind blowing on this issue? Is there one thing that you keep an eye on and say, if the Russians move on this or the Ukrainians move on this, we might have a real resolution to this conflict?
I think for me, the way this war can be brought to a conclusion shorter in the shorter term versus the longer term. Right now, we're headed towards a longer term war, one in which Putin is encouraged to stay the course because he wants to exploit the potential gifts that Donald Trump is offering, including the divides between the U.S. and our alliances. So that's for him. Even if this war is challenging and he's taking enormous losses and it's costly, that prospect is worth exploring to see how much he could get. I think if there is a shift in U.S. policy, if there is a recognition by Donald Trump that it's Putin that's been manipulating him, promising one set of conditions for the summit, because the idea was that Witkoff came back and said, well, we're close to a deal, these are the points. And then very quickly, even before the summit took place, the Russians changed the parameters. They took that agreement and rolled it back. And they took the agreement that in that face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump and rolled it back. Nothing is kind of unless it's, even if it's a document, even if it's an ironclad document, it's still largely irrelevant for the Russians. So if it's the president recognizes that this is the source of his embarrassment, and that on the other side we have these strong relationships with the Europeans, and NATO is now kicking in 5% towards defense, and they're going in as far as they can to build this relationship, and the U.S. pivots to sanctions, and the U.S. pivots to support, even if it's sales. Doesn't have to be grants or whatever the case might be. Even if it's sales, that could then drive a situation where Russia is under significant pressure, and they start to look for different off-ramps.
Okay. All right. So let's open up to questions. And I know there's a lot of questions. We have 15 minutes, so please keep your questions as short as possible. Why don't we start right here on the aisle? And we have some microphones coming around, so just wait for a microphone. And
I'm Eric Mao. I run Geopolitical Forum. And Folly of Realism. So what brand of realism does it refer to? Because I'm familiar with John Mearsheimer's Realism. I don't think he would disagree with the thesis of this book. So can you clarify the realism that the book title refers to.
Sure.
Thank you.
And we're in Chicago, so
Yeah.
you got to be careful.
Yeah, so I think the dissertation was a lot more academic title and descriptive. This one, is I'm selling some books, but in part, I did think it was important and interesting to recognize, and this is what the fundamental case of the book is. What I looked at was critical junctures in the book, so independence, denuclearization, the Ukrainian first Orange Revolution, Georgia War, the war starting in 2014. And what I did was I analyzed these moments, and really consistently we were short-term and transactional. And one of the features of realism is this idea that states pursue their interests and pursue them maximally. So the folly of realism, if you take that to its end stage, like Donald Trump is, everything becomes a transaction. Everything is like, what's immediately in front of you, what's the deal that you can get, and that's the folly of realism. I think in the book itself, I describe the fact that we're practicing faux realism. It's not the classical type of realism that, in some cases, actually, I think Kissinger was a pretty reasonable practitioner. But by and large, certainly in this last era of 35 years and 6 administrations, it's been faux realism, and the folly of realism is this just hyper kind of short-sighted transactional world.
Great. And I'm going to ask a question online as we go, and why don't we come up here with the mic, but I'll ask a question online before we get there. This is from attendee number 13. Can Ukraine prevail with support from Europe, but not the U.S.?
I think the answer is probably yes, but it becomes a long and drawn-out war. Now, there's a nuance to that question. I think the fact is that the Europeans have pledged 5% of their GDP, which is €1 trillion, which is just a massive expenditure. And that kind of expenditure could, if they put that into the defense industrial base, could really robustly accelerate capabilities that are stale or atrophied. But it's going to take some time to get there. The U.S. certainly has to be there in the interim period of time. And I don't necessarily see a risk to the U.S. completely evaporating. I was concerned about this at the beginning of the administration. I wrote about it, that the affinity for Putin and the animus towards Ukraine could result in Trump pulling the plug. And I think he came close on a couple occasions. There was a moment where he completely suspended all cooperation after the Oval Office meeting. But by and large, I think we're at a moment in which we will continue to muddle through. And I find it hard to imagine that he's going to block arms sales. I mean, this is like, there are dollar signs associated with it. So these are deals that he's closing. And therefore, now there's some reporting that actually the Secretary of the Treasury said that we are charging a 10% premium to the Europeans for weapon sales. So who cares? I mean, it's unfortunate and it's awful. But if they're buying these weapons and they get provided to Ukraine, that probably is not as bad as many of the other things that are occurring in this administration. So I think the fact is that this administration, it's likely to sell weapons. It's likely to fill this gap. The Europeans build capability. I think there's a way to get there. It's just without the U.S. in the short term, this becomes an even more protracted war.
Great. I'll go right here to the front.
Thank you for your enlightening remarks. I'm Marilyn Diamond. I'm a board member of the Chicago Council. And my question is, do you think that Ukraine will be invited to join the European Union?
The answer is yes. I think it's a long and drawn-out process, the accession program. Ukraine has to still undertake in the midst of this war and in the aftermath and rebuilding, still some transformative steps to align itself with the EU. But it doesn't have to hit this kind of standard of excellence either, because if we think about how the EU has expanded, it's been a mixed bag on countries and where they were in the trajectory. So I think the answer is certainly yes. I'm going to go a little bit further and say that I think it's inevitable for Ukraine to join NATO also. It's not going to be it's very unlikely to be in this administration. And it might be years before we get there, but that's probably the ultimate security guarantee. And probably more likely than not, Ukraine will ultimately join NATO also.
Great. Why don't we go right here? If you got the tie. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. you talked about domestic polarization of the support for the war and democracy more broadly. Are Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon just taking notes and sending the narrative to OAN and Newsmax? Or is there something more sinister going on why we can't get more Americans to get behind this effort?
More sinister than these folks sharing and conspiring with the news. I think that seems to be a regular feature. It was a feature in the first Trump administration. Actually, the kind of the attacks on me personally were at the instructions of the White House director for strategic communications. So they definitely coordinate their talking points. More sinister, as in, you mean influence campaigns from abroad?
Is something that isn't obvious to people that are paying attention.
I think there's absolutely effort by foreign adversaries to inflame existing divisions. That's been going on. I think where Russians and foreign actors are most effective is when there's a natural fault line that they can exploit and amplify. They tended to try to a scattershot approach to sow discord in societies, and usually when it aligns with something that's already existing, a subtext, they're successful. I don't know if there's more to that. If the implication of the question is there a conspiracy an active conspiracy between the Russians and the Trump administration? I don't think so. I don't think there's anything quite like that. It's just this administration is easily manipulated, ahistorical, has this desire to do business with Russia, but this idea of Trump as an agent, I struggle with this. I mean, because some of these things are just outright irrational. To go so far into Vladimir Putin for nothing in return seems pretty irrational. But I think I would attribute more of that to kind of ignorance and incompetence rather than that he's an agent.
All right. Just one more question online, a relatively light one compared to that last one, which is from attendee number 8. I'm always concerned about Russia's relative weakness conventionally. Do you really think that Russia would not preemptively launch a nuclear weapon?
So there are two different ways that Russia. So I think from the U.S. standpoint, they're concerned about a spiral that directly implicates two nuclear powers, right? So NATO or the U.S. that we get into a war, this kind of confrontation, and it leads to nuclear Armageddon. That is a extremely unlikely scenario. The Russians have no interest in anything like that. Are very, very thoughtful and mindful. They're steeped in nuclear doctrine. The other threshold is nuclear weapons against Ukraine. I think that at times is a cause. It could be a cause for concern. I think the biggest arresting features for something of that nature are that it would destabilize the relationships with Russia's backers, China and India, and that at various points when the former administration was concerned about this, they didn't just rally our allies; they also engaged our adversaries to carry the message to Russia that this is unacceptable. It's not just a taboo, but it would create a rupture between the relationship. So I think that it's unlikely that Russia is going to employ nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory, but that is a much, much lower bar than employing nuclear weapons against NATO or the West. That's pretty much out of the question.
That's great. All right. Okay, why don't we go, that's very eager right there. We'll go over there.
There's some folks in the back too.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'll try to do rapid fire.
We'll do rapid fire. So let's just try to keep the questions tight. Thank you.
Ivan Rueda here. Thank you for the presentation. I'm just thinking that the most, against Russian foot dragging on this peace process, the most powerful weapon the Americans have are secondary sanctions. That's me. I want to know if you agree. But I think we have a deadline. President Trump did slap those secondary sanctions on India, one of the chief supporters, as you just mentioned, of the regime, the Russian regime, and they go into effect at the end of the month. Now, I may have my factual predicates wrong, but let's assume it's right. does it seem likely? And I believe the rate is 25% in addition to the tariffs that now exist on Russians on the purchase on all Indian products coming to the U.S. market. But will that deadline stay? And or will it be kicked down the road? And what do you see the potency of the secondary sanctions in the American arsenal?
I think secondary sanctions are blocking sanctions, and in addition to that, secondary sanctions on Russian oil and gas would be pretty critical. Trump is evasive in omitting China, which is even a bigger consumer of Russian oil and gas. So it could be impactful. Whether he sticks to that timeline, I mean, a lot of this, the deals, the economic deals that he signed, none of them are quite exactly as they're claimed. I mean, the parameters of the deal we have had with the EU, where the EU was supposed to pay like some sort of $600 billion, fine or something like that. That didn't happen. I think these things are very, very fluid, and I'm a little bit concerned that he is not sufficiently. Doesn't sufficiently understand the importance of India to the Indo-Pacific theater and to U.S. long-term relationships, and might be a little bit cavalier with that relationship. But I think if he goes both to India and China, there's an opportunity to really because they would turn off the spigot. They would just it's not worth it for them to buy Russian oil and gas. They'll pay a higher price for Russian oil and gas, even though it's floating their economies, rather than burn relationships with the U.S. But I don't know if we're going to get there.
Excellent. All right, let's go. I'm going to call on the guy who kept his hand up the whole time, so probably breaking a moderator rule, but it worked.
Thank you, Carl. I'm going to keep it short. So in the military mindset, if you're a handler or if you're in charge of a foreign agent who's responsible for meddling in U.S. affairs, kind of like a Dugan would want to see his workers doing. What's 3 sustains and 3 improves from the enemy side that you're looking at that we're doing really well if we're trying to destabilize U.S. foreign policy efforts, or some areas where we would need to improve on if we were to try to do that as a war game of what are the areas that we need to bolster in terms of our foreign policy presence?
Sure. So I think from the enemy side, I think they're quite pleased with the fact that they could feed this administration narratives that regardless of where they're originating from, that they would embrace, whether that's for instance, mail-in ballots. And I think it's all our adversaries are looking for those kinds of narratives, and our friends are also thinking about pandering to this administration to keep it on sides and flatter this administration. It's unvarnished, but that's the way I see it. In terms of I want to leave time for another question. We could maybe talk a bit about that a little more. It's thought-provoking.
Right. Let's do one more question and we'll wrap up. I'm gonna go right here. Good.
Hi, I want to ask you, as a Russian-speaking Jew, I am also a Russian-speaking Jew. Just given President Zelensky's success, that he became the president, that he's done such a good job defending the country, what would you recommend us as the diaspora who, we've gotten education here, we've done decent for ourselves, how can we help him rebuild his country afterwards?
So I think it's important that Ukraine doesn't just win the war, but it also wins the peace. Because if Ukraine is abandoned after there's a ceasefire or a peace, it could and doesn't get the investment, doesn't get any follow through on, somewhere estimates of between $600 billion to $1 trillion, then it could still end up being a failed state. It needs to provide services, it needs to rebuild, and I think that whether it's the diaspora or just the European community, I have some confidence that we're going to get there. Just looking at the transfers from European states to new entrants into the EU, they're massive. Pulling $200 billion over the course of a decade or so. So I think Europe is going to come through, but the U.S. has a role, other democracies have a role, and the Ukrainian and Jewish diaspora have a role too.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for that amazing discussion, Alex. Thank you to everybody here. It's a beautiful night in Chicago. There's lots of places you could be, but to see so many smart, interesting people here, really heartening. And thank you to Leslie and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for such an amazing evening. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.